Hi, everyone. This is a chapter 1 review, and I'm going to make it as fast as possible, trying to keep them under 30 minutes. All right, so these are the big ideas from the chapter. Now, this review won't cover everything that you have to read in the chapter, but it will cover the big main ideas. So these are the big ideas that are included in this chapter. First of all, defining human development, identifying the stages of human development, explaining there's domains that are going to be discussed, and then also the lifespan perspective. And finally, the last section of this chapter is how to do research in lifespan development. You're going to see a lot of key terms that you want to know when covering this chapter. Okay, so as far as introducing human development, there's 3 domains that we'll be looking at all semester long. Every time we look at a life stage, we will be looking at it through these 3 domains. We'll be looking at it through physical, through cognitive perspectives, and through the psychosocial perspective. Let's go into each one of those. So physical includes everything from like how does height and weight change, how does the brain develop, things that involve that are involved in puberty or sexual health, aging. So those are all examples of physical domains that you will be covering throughout the semester. Cognitive includes anything to do with cognitive involves thinking. So it includes language development, logic, abstract reasoning, how we learn, how we understand, how we put things away for storage and for retrieval later. Also includes our moral reasoning, intelligence, and even the concept of wisdom. Finally, the third domain that we'll be looking at all semester throughout every life stage will be the psychosocial perspective. And here it is including everything from our infant temperament, attachment styles, how we process emotions, our personality as adults, and even as kids, our relationships, our identity development, how we date, how we, look at marriage and plan on or not plan on having children, our career development, and finally, as we age, our retirement, and also things like coping with loss and death and dying. Those are all considered psychosocial domains. Often you will hear the name Erik Erikson anytime we are looking at the psychosocial domain. Anytime we're looking at cognitive, make sure you're on the lookout for Piaget, because Piaget is the main cognitive theorist for the cognitive domain. All right, here's some key developmental issues. One of the things that developmentalists talk about a lot is development continuous or is it discontinuous? Continuous means it builds on itself. So one stage is required in order for the next stage to be successful, and that it continues to build skills that are, being built upon. They're cumulative. So it builds on the previous stage. That's the continuous theory of development. Discontinuous development means that development can be unique and that maybe you don't have successful resolution at one stage, but maybe when you get to the next stage, that could take off on its own. And so that's discontinuous development theory. Another key developmental issue is nature versus nurture. If you're familiar with this debate, it is nature includes things like biology, genetics, and nurture involves the environment. A lot of times people get these two confused. So anytime you think of nurture, think of how your parents nurtured you or your caregivers nurtured you. So nature, think of the biology, the gene code, the anatomy that comes with it, everything such as neurotransmitters, even evolutionary theory. So that's all considered part of the nature argument. And obviously we know that these are two perspectives that are always interacting with one another and that cannot be considered completely separate or unique. As far as the basic periods of human development, you want to be aware of the 8 stages. So we will be looking at prenatal, and there's 9 if you consider prenatal. So we'll be looking at prenatal, infancy and toddlerhood, early childhood, which is usually kiddos from 2 to 5, 2 to 6, middle childhood, which is 6 to 11, adolescence, which is usually considered anywhere from 12 to 18. Some theorists even consider up to 21-year-olds still adolescents. Early adulthood, middle adulthood, which is usually from mid 40s up to 60s, and late adulthood, which is even subdivided into young old, which would be your 65 to 74-year-olds, or old category. And old category is usually much more fragile, much more involved with like chronic illness than the young old category is. All right, as far as some of our theories that we need to know in this chapter, you want to know Balti's lifespan perspective, because there are several points that are considered important here when we're studying lifespan. First of all, that it's looking at the entire lifelong process of development, not just childhood development. A lot of times people sign up for the course and they think they're only going to focus on early childhood. But in actuality, you're going to see that we go through all life stages up into old age and death and dying. Development is also multidimensional. There are many dimensions to how we develop. You saw 3 when we mentioned the domains, and there's more than that. Also that it's multi-directional, meaning we're not just always progressing in one direction. Sometimes we go backwards, sometimes we drop, sometimes we jump ahead. And so you want to keep that in mind. Also that it's plastic. Plastic means it's malleable, it's changeable. We're not set in stone. And that's one of the beauties of development, is that things can change. And sometimes for the good, sometimes for the bad. Development is also influenced by the context that we're in, and we have to consider the context. So you will see me discuss a few of the contextual factors. And finally, development is multidisciplinary. You're not just going to see research from psychology, even though this is a psychology course. You will also see research being brought in from sociology, from social work, sometimes from the nursing world, from biology. So you're going to see that there's many disciplines that go into the field of lifespan development. Another argument, debate that is often involved here is sometimes people think they take the class and they're going to study all the abnormal things that come with development. But in reality, the class is designed to teach you what is normative, what is expected at every life stage. And that way we know, oh yeah, that's pretty typical, versus what's not expected, what's not normative and unusual and outside the norm. And so anything that was very unique to you, like if you graduated high school at the age of 12, that would be non-normative. That makes you very different because you're outside the norm. And as far as normative changes, like we like to see, well, what's pretty typical for, a child who's 3 to 5 years old, and then what's atypical and not normative. And so most of the class, you're going to see us focus on normative changes. This is not an abnormal psychology class. This is a development class teaching you what are the normative changes that should be spotted at all the life stages. The contextual influences that I mentioned earlier include cohorts. Cohorts is a group of people that you were born with and that you're kind of going through life with, this same period, same issues. And, we have different things happening, like the cohort that was born during COVID, or maybe the kids who were just about to enter school right when COVID hit, and ended up, staying home and not getting socialized at a certain age, as most kids usually do. So that's going to be a cohort that many people are very interested in studying, because they're going to be different than what we had seen in, the past history, especially in the US. Socioeconomic status is another contextual factor. It's about context. So when we look at things, we always have to consider somebody's cohort, and we also have to consider their socioeconomic status. This is their economic social class. It helps us kind of figure out, well, what's the level of education going on in this family? What's their income level? What is their occupation? And the quality of life that's involved with that. There's lifestyles that we share when we share a certain social class, where we sometimes share parenting styles, or we face certain stressors, especially when we go and we look at lower socioeconomic status. So those are things that we always have to put into context. And then finally, culture. I am Latina. I'm born and raised here in El Paso, Texas. And so we have to consider the culture when we look at, a child and the issues, or an adult even, and the issues they're facing. We have to put that into, well, how common is it to do that in their culture? So, what's considered right or wrong in the Latino culture, or in the African American culture, or in the Asian culture, or Native American culture. So those are all things that, putting it into context, and that way you can see, well, how normative is this? And therefore, these are just some of the contextual factors that we consider. Gender is also one of them. I did not see it addressed very uniquely in the book, but it's also one of the ones that you might want to consider. Girls versus boys go through things differently in development. And some of the key terms when we continue to talk about culture in context would be like ethnocentrism. And sometimes people believe in a certain superiority, that maybe their own culture should kind of weigh over everybody else's, and that it's superior. And a lot of times people can be ethnocentric, and they're judging other people based on what their culture deems correct and deems normal. And so we have to be careful with that ethnocentric ruler, right? When we're judging other cultures and kind of measuring them up to our own. And all right, we already mentioned that development is multidisciplinary, and I mentioned some of these, that psychologists, sociologists, but also, biology, so neuroscientists. We also have obviously research going on in anthropology and education, historians. So just keep in mind, it's not just psychology that you're going to be learning this semester. The second half of the chapter is all about how research is done in lifespan development. And so, the scientific method is, number one when it comes to doing research in psychology in general, because psychology is a, scientific, it's based on the scientific method. And so we have to look at, well, why lean on the scientific method? And we know that, science is cumulative. You build on past knowledge, but you recognize that you don't know everything at this point. There's still a lot more that can come, and there's still maybe some things that you've taken for granted as factual that maybe get later on discovered to be incorrect. And so, we do want to use science and the scientific method, and lifespan development is based using the scientific method. However, when you're studying people across life stages, you're going to see certain designs that become more important and more relied upon than others. As far as sampling, sampling is important, especially when you're trying to do, an empirical study that is going to show that, you treated everybody the same. And so that's where random sampling comes in. And it's one of the techniques that's important, especially when you're doing an experiment and you're trying to show that there's no bias. So everyone had an equal opportunity of being selected for the treatment group versus the control group, etc. We don't always use random sampling, and it depends also on what kind of design you're using. There's various designs. So like if you're trying to do quantitative research, that one's going to be involving and backing up, and looking at a question, exploring a question and backing it up by collecting data, as far as statistics and numbers and, running analyses like statistical analyses. So your research question in a quantitative study, often, you're going to, of course, do a literature review. You're going to determine how you want to gather gather your information? Will you be doing a survey? Will you be doing observational data collection? There's many different methods, which I'll mention some of them briefly. Then you conduct the study, and when it comes to interpreting the results, you have to analyze them using statistical analyses. So finally, at the end, you draw some conclusions, you back it up with your numbers. Sometimes you find that your numbers showed that it was not statistically significant and that everything you did was kind of in vain, and that's so sad, right? But that's what science is about, is asking this question, then going out, collecting data, analyzing it, and seeing, were you able to provide support to your initial hypothesis, or did you find that there really was no differences between the populations? And then, the ultimate form is to get published and make sure that your data gets out there so that others can scrutinize it. So that's a quantitative approach. There's also growing interest in qualitative research. Qualitative research is more about like grounded experiences. And sometimes it can be very unique, or it could be very broad. Maybe there's something very special going on at a certain school in El Paso, and maybe it's a very unique school that has very involved parents, and they're all kind of planning to do something on climate change, and they have committed to raise their kids with the climate and the climate impact in mind. And so in that situation, you would have this very unique small group in a particular setting, with certain people, and maybe it's not about numbers. So qualitative is usually not about numbers. It's more about collecting like interviews and observations, and doing these really unique case studies and looking for patterns or consistencies, but not necessarily by involving SPSS and doing statistical analyses. Instead, you are doing very unique documentation of what was present in that particular group. And then you report those findings as well. So those are two of the designs. There's many other things that can be done in research. A lot of times we're just kind of trying to describe the way things are, and that could be doing an observational study. It could, like I mentioned, case studies. It could be you running a survey. It also could involve, now you may be looking at relationships between variables, and that would be a correlational study. But if you're really trying to make some cause and effect conclusions, that's where people start jumping in, driving into the experimental research realm. And so once you enter the true experiment, that's the only way you can actually make these cause and effect claims and these hypotheses that actually try to identify this caused this. And so in order to do that, you'll see us using terms like independent variable, dependent variable, and going out with a design that's actually testing to see, did this independent variable have a statistically significant effect on the dependent variable? And so the true experiment, you want to note this in your notes, is the only way to establish cause and effect relationships. So correlation does not, and you want to hopefully remember, correlation is not causation. The only way to establish causation is through the true experiment. But in lifespan development research, it's very rare that we actually get to take a group of subjects and subject them to something that we bring upon them as researchers, and then find out what the effects were. If you are going to do that to a group of kids, for example, then obviously it's going to have to be something that you are predicting is going to be beneficial. Most parents would not let their kids participate in a study that's going to be harmful to them, and therefore a lot of times our hands are tied in lifespan development research, because we can't do the true experiment. We can't take a group of pregnant women and say, okay, we're going to have you drink the first 6 months of your pregnancy and let's see what happens. So we can't do that. It's not ethical. It's against the law. And so because we can't do that, we can only look at them correlationally. So we can take a group of women that are pregnant, and we can have them report to us that they have or have not been drinking. And then we can see, well, the ones that reported drinking, these were the effects on their kids. But we can't actually subject a group of pregnant women to harmful effects. And so when we can't do the true experiment, we rely on methods that will make relationship statistics. So we look at things like the correlation, Pearson product correlation, Pearson R, and we look to see, well, how related are these two variables? But we cannot control the variable and say, we're going to increase this much alcohol to see what kind of effect it will have on the unborn baby. So, all right. Correlational research is very popular in lifespan development research. And a lot of times, you're going to see things like a scatter plot, like you see here on this slide. And, if two variables were completely correlated perfectly, then they would have a value of 1. If they have no correlation, they would have a value of 0. And rarely do we see those two extremes. Most of the time, anytime we're studying humans, we're going to see some portion of a relationship. So we might see 0.3, which is not very correlated, or we get closer to the 1, we start seeing 0.7, 0.8. Those start showing us that those two relationships are growing. Those two variables are more highly related. A positive correlation means that as one variable increases, so does the other. A negative correlation means that as one variable increases, the other decreases. And so a positive correlation, you would hopefully expect that as height increases, so does weight. A negative correlation would be things like the number of hours partying versus what would go down. If your hours of partying are high, what would go down would be your grades, right? So that would be a negative correlation. So yes, we look at correlational research a lot in lifespan development. And then we also can do the true experiments as long as we're looking at things that are projected to be beneficial. So experiments, in lifespan research, anytime you see a true experiment, it's a keeper, right? Okay, so we're always looking to test the hypothesis. There's those variables I was mentioning to you. A variable that's independent is the one that the researcher controls. A dependent variable is the one that's affected by the independent variable. What is the major advantage of the true experiment would be that it's the only way to establish cause and effect. And so you want to know this, I will drill it into your head over and over, is that correlation is not causation. Experimental research is the only way to establish cause and effect relationships. But there's disadvantages. Like I mentioned, we can't do the true experiment because of various conditions, and we just can't do it. And so when you can't do it, you rely on research design such as correlational studies. The basic experimental design, usually you start with a sample, maybe it was hopefully a random sample, and you end up assigning people to one of two groups, the experimental group, or sometimes called the treatment group, and the control group. The experimental group is usually exposed to the IV, the independent variable, and the measure of the effect is called the dependent variable. The control group usually is not exposed to the independent variable. And maybe like if it was a drug we were testing, then the experimental group received Ritalin and the control group received a sugar pill that looks like Ritalin. Therefore, they think they're receiving something. And that's called the placebo control group. And then again, at the end, you measure the dependent variables for both of the groups to see if there was a statistically significant difference between the group means. So that's your basic experimental design. I'm going to wrap it up here with the last three research designs that are very popular in developmental science. So one of them is cross-sectional research design. I call this one the layer cake, because this is where we're looking at different age groups perhaps, and we're looking at 20-year-olds versus 50-year-olds versus 80-year-olds. So it's like a layer cake, and we can do this in one shot. Like we could do a survey, and in 1 week we could have data on 20-year-olds, 50-year-olds, and 80-year-olds, and they're all tested at the same point in time. This is the cheapest kind of research to do. It is the least time consuming, and it allows us to compare these groups from 20s, from the 50s, from the 80s. But the disadvantages are large. So because we only took one shot of their behavior, we don't know if we caught them on a good day, caught them on a bad day. We don't know if their behavior is stable over time. And we don't know if maybe maybe there's something unique about these 50-year-olds and made them stand out, but maybe the next time we do it, the next 50-year-olds won't be the same. So there can be lots of disadvantages to just doing cross-sectional research designs. And therefore, longitudinal came about. Longitudinal is when you take a group, a research group, and you study them possibly maybe at age 20, and then you come back and you measure them repeatedly over the long term. So you come back maybe when they're 50 and you do another data collection, whatever it was that you were collecting. And then maybe you wait and see how many of them make it to 80, and then you test them again. So obviously the advantage of doing a longitudinal design is that it can show us, did the differences in these 20-year-olds last over time? There's many disadvantages because this kind of research is expensive. Somebody's got to have those grants that are going to last many, many years. And hopefully the researcher also lasts many, many years. You'll have many subjects possibly drop out over time or pass away. Maybe you're just looking at that cohort, and maybe there was something unique about the 20-year-olds that went through COVID, for example. And so we have to be, aware of that cohort could be different, especially any historical impact that they might have lived through. And then there's attrition, people just kind of, not completing the different parts of the study. And so there's a lot of disadvantages to longitudinal research. But the main advantage would be that, hey, we can see, did this last over time? So if you wanted to see, like, maybe there was a really cool, maybe the early college high school program, you want to see, like, hey, these, graduates, they graduated early, they got their associate's degree at the same time as getting their high school diploma, but did their early exposure to college have any impact over time? And, we're still very early in early college. We don't have anybody who's been out of early college for 30 years already, and so we'll have to wait and see, right? So longitudinal. And then the last one, and I'm going to wrap up the video with this, is the sequential research design. Sequential is a combination of both the cross-sectional, the layer cake, and the longitudinal over time. So this one, it combines the best of both worlds, right? And it allows us to compare the groups to one another and also to see if this lasts over time. Now, this is the most expensive type of research to do. It also requires someone to be around for a long time. And of course, you would be affected by attrition, you would be affected by practice effects, all the things that come with having repeated exposure to whatever assessments you're doing. And so the sequential research design would be the most detailed design, where we would get the richest data, but it's also really expensive to do, and it takes a long time. So we're not going to see that many studies that use the sequential research design. All right, you all. Finally, the chapter ends in having conversations about the ethics that are involved in doing research. I actually serve on the EPCC IRB, the Institutional Review Board. We review any kind of research projects that involve human subjects at EPCC. And, we make sure that, everything that's being done to anybody out there, we scan it, to make sure, hey, is this supposed to be hurtful, or or helpful? Are there risks involved in this research? What are the potential harms? You know, is there informed consent? How did you recruit the participants? Are you offering pay in return? Are you retaining your subjects? So there's just quite a bit that we do anytime anybody is doing research or proposing to do research at EPCC. So here's the final review of what we covered in chapter 1. I hope you found this review helpful, and I'm trying to, like I said, keep them as short as possible. All right, you all, enjoy.